Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here so early. And thank you to CannMed for inviting me, and to all the sponsors. This is the best cannabis conference that I've been to in a long time. And more, it's feeling like a family of people working together in a common mission. And it's just beautiful. So I'm so thankful this morning. Last night I was talking with my friend Nicole, who thanked me for always making her feel like she doesn't know anything after my presentations. And my response was, well, actually, I have a whole presentation about that tomorrow. I've never actually designed my presentations to do that before, but apparently that's the intention today. So I want to show you something that I've been thinking a lot about over the last 13 years of clinical practice, based on observations I've had in my patients and things that I've found in the primary literature, and how we can tie that all together to have a better and deeper understanding of the potential of cannabis. We know that there is a huge untapped potential in this plant, and we just don't know exactly where to look, so I'm going to point you in a certain direction. And to do that, we might need to zoom in a little bit. We have a beautiful flower from my backyard, this first picture. And then as we zoom in, it starts to look a little different, a little like a fantasy world. And as we get even closer, it starts to look a little bit like an alien landscape. And this is where I want to take you today. Suddenly we went from cannabis land to mushroom land. But when you zoom in like this and you get a deeper understanding of what's happening in one small part of the cannabis world, then I think we can zoom out again with a better appreciation for the whole. So whenever we zoom in during this presentation today, let's stick with the whole as well. We're going to talk about some cannabis dosing trends, Hormesis and its role in medicine. It might be a new term for some of you. Preclinical evidence for low and ultra-low dosing. We'll talk about some of the potential mechanisms of action, and then I'll bring the rubber to the road for some recommendations for researchers, producers, and patients. A lot of you have heard this phrase, the dose makes the poison, which is a paraphrase of a quote from Paracelsus, who lived in the 14 and 1500s. All things are poison and nothing is without poison. Only the dose allows something to not be poison. And for the AV guys in the back, thank you for doing such a good job. Could you make my next slide a little bigger? I don't have notes on the PowerPoint, so I don't need that big thing there. So when we overdose on THC, we tend to see paradoxical effects. You look at the list of symptoms that can occur with an overdose, you'll see almost everything that cannabis could cure or treat at an appropriate dose. Nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, all these GI complaints, anxiety and paranoia. It can cause headache, myoclonus, hyperkinesis, like needing to move around, and twitching and confusion, and even psychosis. Now, this most commonly occurs when somebody eats a delicious-looking treat that has an appetite stimulant in it that makes them want to eat more, or when the poor patient receives a tube of dark stuff from one of their friends that really wants to help and tells them to start with a half grain of rice, and they wake up in the middle of the night in an acute psychosis. Not fun. And sorry, guys in the back, I don't know if I misspoke, but now I've got the same thing on both sides. I'd love to have one of what I'm talking about and one of what's coming next, if you can swing that. So if you look in my clinical practice at the oral dosing range that's been effective, and this includes some outliers, we could go all the way down to 0.01 milligrams of cannabinoids per kilogram of body weight of the patient per day, all the way up to 100 milligrams per kilogram. So here we have like a 10,000-fold dosing range, which is quite unusual. And like I said, there's some outliers, but I've seen people, I start them at 1 milligram of maybe THC before bed, and they sleep well, and they never have to titrate after that. And then we published a case last year of a woman that was taking around 7,000 milligrams of total cannabinoids daily with breast cancer, and she did really well with that. even these huge doses are far from the toxic doses in primates. Monkeys were treated with 9,000 milligrams per kilogram of THC, and they survived that, even though I'm sure they did not enjoy that. And now, within this huge, broad dosing range, we have nonlinear dose-response effects, which means as you start at a low dose and titrate up, people will start getting better and better results until you go past some threshold, and beyond that, the patient starts building tolerance and losing efficacy. So these are nonlinear dose-response effects, and they show up all over the preclinical literature of cannabis. Here's an example of locomotor activity in rats. And as you can see, let's see if I can get my, my laser to work here. Is it up there? It's a little dim. But as you can see, if you go at a low dose, 0.2 milligrams per kilogram of THC, locomotor activity decreases. So these rats aren't running around as much. As you increase the dose of THC, the locomotor activity increases above the baseline. And then as you increase it even more, it goes back down again. This is not unusual with cannabinoids, not unusual when interfacing with a homeostatic regulatory system. And it shows up all over the place, not just in rats, but also in humans, and not just with THC, but also with CBD. Here's an example of a study in humans that was looking at purified CBD for treating anxiety, and they tested that with a public speaking challenge. And you can see here that 300 milligrams of CBD reduced anxiety, 100 did not, and 900 did not. There's a sweet spot in there. And what about all the doses that they didn't test in this study? What else are we missing? That's what I want you to keep asking. Where are my blind spots, and what else am I missing? That 300 milligrams of CBD could outperform clonazepam, and 900 do nothing. Now, throughout the years of my clinical practice, we've had experience with this. I've met a lot of people that were down here in the red circle, and I taught them how to get back up here to their optimal dose, a dose at which people do not have tolerance. They've maintained efficacy for years or decades, and they have less side effects and better efficacy. So we have had this experience of reducing the dose of cannabis and getting better results. What might be going on down here that we don't know about? So this is something that's been interesting me. And there's a concept in biology, the term was coined in 1943. It's called hormesis, and it's derived from the Greek term to excite. It describes a dose-response phenomenon in which a low dose will stimulate and a high dose can inhibit. And it was discovered using the fungicidal extract of the red cedar tree. And the researchers mentioned on this page, they looked at concentrations of this antifungal and tested it against numerous fungal species. And they noticed that at higher concentrations, it was an antifungal. It killed the fungus. But if you diluted it enough, it would make the fungus grow faster. Why would an antifungal at a low concentration increase the rate of growth? Anybody got an idea? I mean it. Put your hand up if you've got an idea. Sure. Nobody? All right. Oh, yeah, Mike. Exactly. So he said we have mechanisms that are designed to detoxify, and when you use those, so how I would frame this is that when we challenge the cell with a toxin at a concentration that's not high enough to kill it, but is high enough to turn on those cellular defense and repair mechanisms, then we get a net benefit, right? We nudge the health of that cell just enough that it's upregulated. And I think that a lot of you are familiar with this concept, right? The best example in your lives, hopefully, is exercise. If you exercise too much, you're going to hurt yourself. But if you exercise the right amount, you're providing a stress to your system that allows it to get stronger. So this is like the what doesn't kill me makes me stronger. And one way in which we respond to exercise is through the endocannabinoid system. Here you can see more than a doubling of anandamide levels after 30 minutes of running on a treadmill. Singers get this from singing as well. So looking at some of the other things in our lives, a lot of you may have heard about resveratrol. This is a compound in foods that is believed to have helped the French prevent heart disease by drinking wine. I'm not sure it works like that. This is an antioxidant, and if you look at the potential benefits, you'll see that it kind of looks like cannabis: anti-cancer, anti-aging, neuroprotection, anti-diabetic, cardioprotective, and so forth. Here's a molecule that does all these different things, and even though it's an antioxidant, the quantities of resveratrol that we consume aren't going to provide ORAC values that have all of those effects in our body. So what's resveratrol doing? It's actually upregulating our endogenous antioxidant and repair mechanisms. So you could think of it almost like a toxin that's making us stronger. Resveratrol, like cannabis, has a lot of hormetic effects. And as you can see on the right, this is a rodent study of a model of heart attack. At low doses of resveratrol, the damage and apoptosis to the heart is decreased. But if you go too high on the dose of resveratrol, you actually increase the damage to the heart. You see that? So it's a healthy thing at a low dose, but it can be toxic at a higher dose. However, let's look at another model of resveratrol. Here are breast cancer cells. And you can see that at low concentrations, it's accelerating the growth of these cells. But at high concentrations, it's inhibiting. How do you get it right? How do we know? And how do we use hormesis in medicine? Well, it's actually used a lot in medicine. Here's one example that some of you may be familiar with. It's called preconditioning hormesis. So if you remember the movie The Princess Bride, the pirate was going through this battle of wits with the clever villain, and there was poison that could be placed in one goblet of wine or the other, but the pirate put it in both because he had spent years before this battle of wits taking tiny doses of the same poison every day and gradually increasing his dose so that if he ever had this opportunity, he would win the battle. That's preconditioning hormesis. He took tiny doses of a toxin to upregulate his endogenous healing mechanisms so that when he had a big challenge, he could handle it. It's not exactly the same as the idea of, well, probably the old definition of vaccines. Who knows what's happened to the new one? But not exactly the same as that, but kind of similar, right? Expose yourself to a non-lethal dose of something that could prepare you for something bigger in the future. So that's preconditioning hormesis. And then there's also post-conditioning hormesis. Oops, what happened? We went back. Post-conditioning hormesis, which is probably most well known in homeopathy. But what a lot of you probably don't know is that cannabis has been in the world of homeopathy since 1841. And you give tiny, tiny, tiny doses of cannabis to people that exhibit the symptoms of having too much cannabis. They haven't had too much cannabis, but those are their symptoms. So you're giving something similar that could produce those in a big dose, but you're giving it in such a small dose that the body will correct. It'll, again, upregulate these corrective mechanisms in our physiology. So how does cannabis work? Well, I think a lot of us are focused on the way in which it mimics and supports our innate stress response pathways. But could it also act as a hormetic stressor? And I'm going to show you some evidence that it certainly can. And I want to orient you to this ultra-low dose. Now, it's impossible to convert a dose that's injected into a rodent into an oral dose for humans, but I do my best here. So a lot of these studies I'm about to show you use 0.002 milligrams of THC per kilogram of body weight of the rodent. Intraperitoneal injection is about 5 times better absorbed than oral. There's this kind of allometric scaling law from rodents to people. And so what we might end up with is somebody my size having, or a little smaller than me, having like a 20th of a milligram of THC orally. This is the kind of dosing range that I'm about to show you. Something between like 100th and a half of a milligram of THC. Let's just give it a range, okay? So we're actually going to start out just a little bit lower. Here's a study from 2007 in which a single injection of 0.001 milligrams per kilogram had a significant negative impact on the performance of the mice 3 weeks later. And their performance was in a stressful memory test called the Morris-Water Maze test. Okay, one teeny injection, measure them 3 weeks later compared to vehicle, and the ones that got this small dose of THC did worse. Also, interestingly, when you give a high dose of THC to rodents, they get hypothermia, analgesia, and decreased locomotion, also catalepsy, but they didn't do that in this study. Give this tiny dose of THC to the rodents, and they get the opposite. They get warmer, they get sensitive to pain, and they run around more. What the heck is going on here? We saw these paradoxical effects with an overdose. Now we're seeing paradoxical effects with an underdose, or maybe the 10 mg per kg is the overdose. It's hard to say. So then a subsequent study looked at 0.002 milligrams per kilogram, a single injection, which was able to induce measurable cognitive deficits in normal mice 5 months later. Give them a single shot of 0.002, measure them 5 months later compared to the vehicle, and you can determine that they're impaired. And you can measure different pathways have been upregulated in the cerebellum 5 months later in mice after a single injection. Now, what's strange about these mice? They're normal. That's the strangest thing about them, something that I can't claim about any of you out there or about myself. Because who among us is a wild type with no other toxins or challenges in their life, right? So what happens when we treat mice that maybe have a challenge in their life? So this is a toxin called pentylene tetrazole, and it was injected at a high dose, 60 milligrams per kilogram. It's known to produce neurotoxicity. And in this study, the researchers administered that same single dose of THC, but either before the toxic challenge or after, so preconditioning or post-conditioning, like we talked about, 1, 3, or 7 days before, or 1 or 3 days after. The behavioral tests evaluated different aspects of memory and learning 3 to 7 weeks later. And what these researchers found was that both the preconditioning and the post-conditioning administration of ultra-low-dose THC completely obliterated the damage from the toxic challenge and demonstrated reduced phosphorylated ERK activity. So we have evidence of ultra-low-dose pre- and post-conditioning and a toxic challenge. This is the difference between using cannabis in an isolated environment where it could actually reduce the function because you're giving it maybe a tiny bit of a toxin versus using it to upregulate the healing. Now, it doesn't just do that in the brain. It does that in the heart. Here's a single low dose administered 2 hours before a myocardial infarction. Look at the size of the infarct difference in that bar graph. And that was the best result, but if you administered it 48 hours before a heart attack, you still got measurable, statistically significant cardioprotection. If you gave the same low dose every day for 3 weeks and stopped 24 hours before the heart attack, still got cardioprotection. What could these ultra-low doses be doing? It's not just in the brain, not just in the heart, it's also in the liver. Here's liver enzyme measurements. When the ultra-low dose of THC was administered 2 hours before an ischemia reperfusion injury in rodents. And you can see much lower levels of ALT and AST on the right. On the left, it's the sham group that just got the surgery, but not the liver injury. So that's all just purified THC in an ultra-low dose, just a little sample of what's out there. And then here we have low dose, but not ultra-low dose, 3 milligrams per kilogram per day, given to mice that had cognitive decline. So these are old mice, they're exhibiting signs of dementia. Give them this low dose of THC for a month, and it restored the gene transcription patterns so that the expression of these THC-treated 12-month-old mice was almost identical to the 2-month-old mice. Literally, like, turn the gene expression in their mind around, in their brain around. Here's a map, just to remind you that we're dealing with a lot of complexity here. These are all the genes that had a change from compared to vehicle. All of these different genes were upregulated in pink and some were downregulated, and their pathways are interrelated. We are living in such a complex... This diagram makes me think of like trying to use our equipment to understand something that's much more intelligent than us, right? And we're getting there, but we're definitely not there. I'm sure this is also just the tip of the iceberg. So now we're back to ultra-low dose, 24-month-old mice injected with a 0.002 milligrams per kilogram performed significantly better than those that did not get that injection or not get the THC, and performed similarly to mice aged 2 months. So the last study was low dose every day for 28 days. This was a single ultra low dose injection, restored 24-month-old mice to the behavior levels of 2 months, and that effect lasted for 7 weeks. What the heck is going on here in this ultra low dose range? And the pathways by which this worked, some of them were elucidated. Sirtuin-1 is a pathway that's gaining a lot of attention kind of in the biohacking world. And and then the MRI just demonstrated larger volume and higher tissue density in various regions of the brain. And the mice that received the THC, it actually changed the volume of their brain, a single ultra low dose. Measurable differences for 7 weeks. And then the last rodent model I'll show you, this is a familial Alzheimer's disease model. Mice that were either 6 or 12 months were given a single low-dose injection, ultra-low-dose injection, and a lot of cognitive tests. What's interesting here is on the left, that's the Water-Morris maze. The higher levels, so dark is vehicle, light is ultra-low-dose. WT means the wild type, the healthy mice, and the TG means transgenic, the Alzheimer's mice. And if you just look at the Alzheimer's mice, you can see getting that ultra-low dose of THC really improved their performance on this water maze test. It also improved the performance a little bit of the wild-type mice. If you look at the novel location recognition in the middle, you can see the wild-type was a trend towards decreased performance, and same in the Y maze. So again, we have the same thing that might be gently hurting wild-type mice, helping mice that have a disease. That's an important point. And then yesterday we heard about the TRKB1 receptor pathway for BDNF. Well, these transgenic Alzheimer's mice, they express a truncated TRKB receptor that's not functional. It's like a broken receptor. And the ratio of that broken receptor to the fully functional receptor determines our capacity to respond to BDNF and grow new neurons and new synapses and heal the brain. And you can see here also the ultra-low dose of THC significantly reduced the expression of that truncated receptor, meaning their BDNF pathway was working better. So what are the mechanisms? We talked about hormesis, but I want to go beyond hormesis into pharmacodynamic and pharmacokinetic synergy. That means how they're working together or how they're absorbed and metabolized. Because so far we've only talked about THC, but let's look at CBDA, for example. Now, the scale here is micrograms per kilogram, not milligrams per kilogram, and you can see here that half or 1 microgram per kilogram of CBDA reduces nausea in rodents, which is very different from CBD. You can see the effectiveness of CBD is here at 5 or 10 milligrams per kilogram, not half of a microgram per kilogram. So much higher potency. Now, you know, what else you see with the CBD picture is the, there we go. So you can see that at very high doses of CBD, even without the lithium chloride challenge, even just with saline, you get some nausea. And at the 20 and 40 milligrams per kilogram, you get an exacerbation of the effects of the lithium chloride, which is what causes the nausea. So we're back to this biphasic dose-response model, right? There's a sweet spot in there. So what about combinations? Here's a study that looked at ultra-low dose THCA and CBDA in combination for nausea. These are tiny, tiny doses, 0.00001 milligrams per kilogram of CBDA, another very low dose of THCA. These two doses on their own are not effective. Put them together and you see that they are effective with the bar graph that goes down in the middle. And then if you block the PPAR alpha receptor, you ameliorate that benefit, and if you block the serotonin receptor, it goes away as well. Similar things happen with CBDA and pain. Here you see 10 micrograms per kilogram of CBDA reducing hyperalgesia, but 1,000 micrograms per kilogram, meaning 1 milligram per kilogram, not reducing hyperalgesia. There's another sweet spot here. Do you need the teeniest little bit of CBDA? Maybe. It's hard to know. This is a model of inflammatory pain. And the CBDA was only effective when given before the inflammatory challenge. And that was given via injection. However, if you give it orally and you give it with a teeny bit of THC, a bit of THC on its own that does nothing, So now we're at 100 micrograms per kilogram, but when you give them together orally, it works. That's what we're seeing here. And it even works when you give it after the inflammatory insult. So it works even better than the CBDA on its own at the precise dose when it's injected. What's going on with CBDA? Here's an example of pharmacokinetic interactions. This was a beautiful study from Jonathan Arnold's group in Australia. They tested a whole plant compound, which you see on the left. It's got just about everything in it, acidics and neutrals. And then they tested the exact same doses of those isolated substances for oral bioavailability in rodents. And this is what you would expect to find. When you administer lipophilic compounds together, they can compete with absorption. And so you would expect to see better absorption from purified CBD than the same dose of CBD given in the context of this extract. So that's a normal finding. This was the unexpected finding. CBDA, when administered in the context of the full plant extract, was much, much better absorbed, 14 times better absorbed than the same dose given on its own. Why is CBDA absorbed so much better when it's given in the full plant extract? Well, these researchers determined that there's an efflux pump called the BCRP that kicks these cannabinoids back into the lumen of the intestine as they're being absorbed. But if you have a little bit of CBG or a little bit of THC in there, it blocks the function of this efflux pump in relation to CBDA, and it makes you absorb much more CBDA. So 14 times the absorption when there's a tiny bit of THC or CBG. We haven't proven this in humans, but we do have some human data that shows that CBDA is much, much better absorbed than CBD. Again, in these studies, it was between 5 and 11 times better absorbed. THCA is 32 to 51 times better absorbed than THC. Just remarkable. So we're going to bring it home right now, and I just want to remind you that there's a lot of cannabinoids in the plant, and we're exposed to them at ultra-low doses all the time. What is going on here? We don't know, but we can have a direct relationship with the plant to help us find out. I'm going to skip through one example of clinical data because I want to get to my recommendations and maybe a question or two. So for researchers, I encourage you to take what you've learned today and design studies that include a range of doses or concentrations that can reveal nonlinear dose-response effects. And please don't forget to go down to microgram per kilogram rodent studies if you have the opportunity to do so, because you probably find some very interesting things down there. Test trace cannabinoids and other phytoconstituents alone and in combinations. We have Hinanit and Dedi that have been doing this, and that's really exciting. That's where this research needs to go. For producers, I encourage you to include a broad range of compounds. Try to get as much from that flower into the bottle as you can. Avoid complete decarboxylation, because even tiny bits of these acidic cannabinoids go a long way, as you could see. They might actually go a longer way than high doses. And please make your labels and certificates of analysis easy to understand. That's a big problem in this industry. I don't think it's been mentioned much. It should be easy for a patient to know how much they're getting per drop or per serving. Here's an example of a part of the COA from a healer product called Balance, which includes 19 chemovars. 6 of them are CBD dominant type 3, and the rest are type 1. We blend as many together as we can. It's half decarboxylated. It's got equal proportions of CBD, CBDA, THC, THCA. This is like a shotgun product. I hope that eventually we know, here's the specific chemovar for this specific problem and this specific person with their current functional status and their genetics. We're far from that right now. So until I can get my laser pointer and a sniper rifle, we're going to go with the shotgun, right? The Balance. For clinicians and patients, I encourage you to explore this oral dosing range in your patients. Don't start too high. This means starting as low as 0.5 milligram or maybe 1 milligram for the average adult. And if you do that and you take your time and wait, they might not get great results the next morning and be like, oh my God, that was amazing. My life has changed. You gave me my life back. And I know it feels really good to hear that. But if they stay consistent with low doses for a little while, they'll get some impressive results. You'll be surprised. And that's especially with acidic cannabinoids and whole plant preparations. And titrate slowly if possible. Use cannabis to improve resilience to stress. Don't always think about it for treating a disease. Think about what could it do to upregulate your natural healing mechanisms. Turning on these intrinsic mechanisms may provide better results than just ameliorating symptoms, because you're getting healthier, you're getting stronger, you're getting more fit for your environment. Your homeostatic physiology is functioning more efficiently, and that's not only going to make you feel better, but prevent future disease, instead of just covering up a symptom without addressing the underlying vulnerability. So watch for gradual changes, healing versus symptom relief, and secondary outcomes and side benefits. And know yourself. Cannabis is very complex, but so are you. And you have a direct relationship with this plant, or at least the capacity to do so. So the cannabis state of consciousness can be extremely empowering for self-awareness and body awareness. One can use a little bit of THC and actually go inside and feel and get extremely accurate messages about what's happening inside of them. So allow the consciousness shifting aspect of cannabis from time to time to help you get better in touch with yourself. With all our healer products, we include these guides so people can check in with themselves, do the inner inventory, write it down on the worksheet, and so forth. And then my last recommendation page, if you're a patient and you're not using acidic cannabinoids, I highly encourage you to do so. Easiest way is take a little bud and throw it in your morning tea or coffee. You'll steep it, you'll get a little bit out of that, and I can tell you more about that if you need to. Avoid tolerance in most cases, so check out that sensitization protocol. If you feel like you're overusing, you'll have a much healthier and more fruitful relationship with cannabis if you reverse tolerance. And then be aware of the subtle benefits. Try a variety of chemovars and blends of chemovars, and the cannabis tea is just a great thing for a lot of people. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dustin, for your great talk and your great work. I wanted to ask you, what do you think? How low would you go? Would you touch that also
in rodents or in humans?
Humans. What is the line between going low and homeopathy?
Yeah, so I think that, well, because I've seen results in adults at 0.5 milligram of an active constituent a day, that's how low I go right now. I don't like to waste a lot of people's time, and that might still be a time waster. I skipped over a study in fibromyalgia, women with fibromyalgia, where they started at about 1 milligram of THC per day and were titrated only every 10 days. And they had fabulous results with that type of titration. They went from 1 to 2, every 10 days. So something low and slow to me sounds like that, 0.5 milligram to 1 milligram.
Good morning, Dustin. Thank you so much and for your spirit here. Question, so titrating to find that optimal dosage, how about for tolerance breaks? Is it cold turkey, titrate down? What's your recommendation for that?
So the way I've framed the sensitization protocol on healer.com involves 48 hours of abstinence from cannabis, but it's very intentional, and I have all sorts of videos to hold your hand through that and give you exercises, breathing, meditations, things to get you through that. There's a lot that you can do to go through that 48 hours, but a lot of, there's one fMRI study in men at least that were heavy cannabis smokers that showed after just 48 hours of abstinence, their CB1 receptors in the brain returned to normal levels. So I think that's one beautiful thing about cannabis is we don't need super long tolerance breaks. 48 hours can do it, but then we continue with 3 days. The key to the sensitization protocol isn't just the tolerance break, it's what you do afterwards. It's how you change your relationship with the plant to listen to its effects on your body so that you don't get into a tolerance problem again in the future. So that's what's happening over the next 3 days, very careful titration. And you can get that it's all complimentary on healer.com. I'm out of time. Thank you so much. It's great to be here with you.